Hello, everyone. Welcome back to OTD Military History. Today, just going to get right into it. Very excited to have the great Tim Cook on the channel for the first time. I've been wanting to do this for a long time, just never really seemed to work out with timing, but now it is. So we are going to be talking about his newest book today, The Good Allies. Oh, there we go. How Canada and the United States fought together to defeat fascism during the Second World War. So as a lot of you know, I've talked about Tim's books in the past. There's a whole number of them. So what we're going to do is talk about the book today, questions as is, and any more like general questions, I guess we'll kind of keep those towards the end. So now we'll just jump in and we'll get talking about the book. So thanks, Tim, for coming on. I really, really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're very busy with all the writing and the tours and everything and your day job at the museum. So I really appreciate you coming on to talk about your book.
My pleasure, Brad. Great to be on here, and hello to everyone. And yeah, thanks, Brad. I look forward to talking about it.
Yeah, so I got the book. I've been reading it for a while. It's been an interesting time to read about it. Read this book, given what's going on. So we'll kind of probably touch on that as we move forward a little bit. But as my regulars know, I always ask the same question. Again, you got like quite a background in this stuff and an extensive publication list. But why Canada and the U.S. in Second World War? Why was that at this time the project that you were focusing on?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Yeah, I counted up the other day. This is my 19th book or edited collection. It includes some smaller museum catalogs and some scholarly edited stuff. But yeah, I've explored a lot on Canada and the two world wars. And why this one? Well, it seemed to me that we needed a book that brought together the military and the diplomatic and the financial and the wartime economy of the North Americans. And I started working on this about 2 years ago. I'd published my book, Lifesavers and Body Snatchers, which was on the medical war in the First World War. And I typically give myself a day of rest, and then I jump into the next project. And I'd been thinking about this one for some time. There are a number of motivations, but one of them was going to the World War II Museum in New Orleans. It's a fabulous museum. I love the stories and the artifacts and the storytelling there. But if you've been there, and I imagine some of the people on the show here have, there's not a lot on Canada. And I remember leaving there and thinking, okay, I get that. Canada doesn't stand with the United States or the Soviet Union or Britain, but we were an important partner in the war. And so I came back to Canada, and I've always thought for Canadians, it's up to us to tell our story, right? Like, it's not up to the Americans or the British or the French or the Germans or anyone else. So we've got to put the hard work in, drawing out the material from secondary sources and archival sources. And so that's really what motivated me. And I was also aware, of course, that, the book would come out in September of 24. I hit my deadlines, and I knew the election would be on. And I wanted to remind our American friends that Canada had been a good ally during the Second World War, and that the defense of North America couldn't have happened without Canada. Yeah. And yet, as part of my research, Brad, I found it's a bit of an interesting thesis. There are a number of arguments in the book, but one of them is Canada's primary national strategy, I suppose, in the war is to support Britain, to keep Britain in the war. But we can't do that without leaning into the United States. And how we do that is a real challenge, because we haven't had to negotiate those halls of power before in Washington. So that's one of the key arguments, but there are several in the book.
Yeah, definitely. That's, to me, well, I mean, obviously biased with my own background in academic history, and studying this for a long time as well. But that's clear to me is, I don't know what the word to use, because I don't think balance is the right word, especially with the way you've written it, because it's not a balance. It's not trying to be both being good to U.S. and Britain at the same time. It's also keeping Canadian interests usually at the forefront. I mean, that's part of the thing. Some of the things you talk about in there is it can't always be that. That was an interesting part to me, because I mean, came up with my own little work in Hong Kong and how that all connects. But to me, and we were chatting about this before, is I want to start off, because I want to talk about King in a bit, because I can't not. But is the production. I think that's one that gets not forgotten, but is not discussed as much. And I was kind of wondering on your thoughts, especially looking at the US, right? You know, the arsenal of democracy, how Canada's kind of role in this gets lost, because Canada's cranking out a ton of stuff.
It really is. And I'm sure, Brad, when you talk to your friends, American scholars, British scholars, there really isn't an acknowledgement of Canada's wartime production. I think, and you know, I'm guilty of this. I wrote a 3-volume history of Canada in the Second World War, 2 volumes on the fighting fronts, 1 volume on veterans and memory. I didn't really look much at the home front, and as part of that wartime production. Now, the arsenal of democracy, there's not an equality here, but as I argue in the book, Canada was a significant producer of weapons. 16,400 aircraft, including about 1,600, so 10% of those for the U.S. Navy, Helldivers and Catalinas, I think. You know, we produce hundreds of millions of shells, hundreds of thousands of machine guns. You know, the list goes on and on without sounding like an accountant. Maybe our greatest contribution, 850,000 vehicles, including the CMP trucks and other key vehicles, including a stat I found in late 1942, Monty's 8th Army in North Africa, half of the trucks in the 8th Army are made in Canada. So, you know, we're almost hiding in plain sight. And that's one aspect of the war effort that I really wanted to draw out, partially because it makes a lot of sense if you're looking at Canada and the United States as opposed to Canada and Britain. That's often the analysis that we look at. Now, your own work is in the Pacific, but there aren't a lot of scholars who look at that in Canada. We're very much focused on the Canadian-British relationship because, of course, we fight with them, the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Navy, the Canadian Army. It's all integrated within that British fighting system. But when you begin to look north-south, and that was one of the things I wanted to do, you get a very different view of the war. And I'm sure we'll talk about Mackenzie, King, and Roosevelt. But that wartime production is a key element. And frankly, Canada couldn't have done it without the United States. I had a sense of that before I began to research it. But really, from the start of the war, we're piggybacking on the auto industry. And by 42 and 43, our wartime industry is humming along. But we, again, couldn't have done it without the Americans. And on the flip side, the Americans acknowledge that Canada is playing a key role here. We're sending critical minerals down to the U.S., nickel and aluminum, billions of pounds of this. So like it's a significant amount, hydroelectricity and other things. So that's a key part of the war. And I really like that chapter in the book because I think it helps to draw out a hidden or neglected aspect of the Canadian total war effort that is beyond that of the fighting forces.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And I've really said this before on the channel. I'm getting more and more interested in not necessarily just the home front idea, but how it's all interconnected. Because I think without that context, things get lost. So in that, my thinking is the production of it all. And one thing I did want to ask about this, because I've talked about it a little bit on the channel before, because I did a video looking at Canada and Britain and the United States and how that all went economically and mostly the loans, which can be kind of boring, but other cooperation like the Manhattan Project, that one has always been striking to me because I was wondering if you came across this in your own research about you talk about it, the mining of the uranium. You talk about how it's Canada and the Congo, as it was called at the time.
Yeah.
Was it only Canada that was providing that uranium, or was there some coming from elsewhere? Or did you even come across that? I mean, just random question, but I just kind of interested.
Yeah, we send all of our uranium down to the United States for the Manhattan Project, and there's a couple of ways to look at it. But one of the ways I do in the book is that the British expect us to send them all the uranium, right? I mean, the atomic story is a complex one, and I can't do it justice here, but of course, the British have early scientific advances. The Americans reach out to them and see, can we work together here? And the British basically snub them.
Yes.
And then the Americans go it alone. And of course, the Manhattan Project is a marvel of just incredible productivity and scientific knowledge and mobilization of resources. then the British fall behind and they begin to send scientists to Canada. And so it's a really interesting story. But they expect all of our uranium to go to them. And we have to make the choice. And we decide to send it south. And that really angers the Americans. But, the British, sorry. But at that point, Canada understood that we needed to strengthen that relationship with the United States, because so much of our minerals, raw material, are going south. And there's a really great quote. I think it's a newspaper journalist who says, basically, I think it's in 1942, the border has almost disappeared between these two countries.
Right.
The interoperability here. And I think, again, that gets forgotten. But during this process, there's always this continual challenge of how much are we going to lean into the Americans at the risk of our own sovereignty in order to help Britain. Now, very early in the war, we understand, after the cataclysmic fall of France, the retreat of the British Army, where they leave behind most of their heavy kit and trucks and weapons, we've got to keep Britain in the war. And so that's when Mackenzie King, our long-serving prime minister, goes to Washington. And he's a pretty important player in this story.
Yeah, I was going to say that's where I wanted to lead to next, is as someone who grew up in the 90s, the whole idea of the free trade was everywhere. So it's kind of hard not to have that impact how you're thinking about this. But, looking at King and Roosevelt's relationship, which I want to get to after, but in the specific way, I wanted to ask kind of your insights on this, because obviously you say in the book that this is from the Canadian perspective, right? Because Canada's at war first, right? And there's things like the Hyde Park Agreement and all that stuff. I was wondering if you could kind of speak on those both, right? The Canadian perspective of those issues of sovereignty, the border pretty much disappearing when it comes to that sort of stuff, but also some American, not necessarily hesitations, but uncomfortableness with allying with country at war. Like I was wondering, look at
and it's worth, it's worth just pausing there and thinking about that. Right, in September of 39, Britain goes to war on the 3rd of September. Canada, which has control over its foreign policy, waits a week. There's a healthy debate in the House of Commons, but we were always going into this war at Britain's side, and we're at war. And of course, everyone has looked to the United States and President Roosevelt, and he had already made a historic speech in Kingston in August of 1938 saying he wouldn't let Canada stand by and be invaded, which wasn't the same that he was going to come into the war, but Canadians had maybe interpreted that, and Roosevelt, who had become a little pushed aside his appeasement kind of inclinations as Hitler had marched to war. And yet, of course, the United States doesn't go into the war. And I was able to look into the Roosevelt archives, and it was really interesting. I think there was one opinion poll where it's like 2.5% of Americans support going into the war. That's not 25%, like 2.5%. Yeah. So clearly Roosevelt understood his own countrymen. He understood the isolationist urge. The greatest shield to the North Americans, Canada and the United States, is our geography, of course. And the U.S. is as deeply unprepared for war as is Canada. And yet here we are at war. And so that relationship is a challenging one. Again, to our American friends who are listening here, think about what it would have been like for almost 2 years. Is a country on your northern border, 9,000 kilometer shared border, is at war, which is sending all of its best defenses, squadrons, destroyers, army formations to defend Britain, especially after the fall of France and that cataclysmic defeat there. So that needs to be negotiated. And, I'd read about this, and Brad, you've read about it and probably written about it too. But it's when you look at it with new eyes, and the new eyes were this, for me, the North-South relationship. When you continually look at that, as opposed to most history books, which look at this time period very quickly, figure out that we somehow do a security deal, the finance is covered, and then we can get on to the real show, which is figuring out how we're going to fight overseas. But of course, it's not that easy, right? It's not easy because Canada and the United States had very few diplomatic relations or military connections. They had no joint plans on how to secure the East Coast or the West Coast, or they are just beginning to work these out. And this takes time and effort, especially with one country at war and preoccupied and the other not. So, so I lay that out, and there's a number of security agreements and financial agreements that are crucial. And I think the key thing to boil down here, without going to all the details, and hey, there's a great book for sale, so maybe that's something that people might want to explore. But it is really King and Roosevelt, and we've talked around them a bit, and they're a bit of an unlikely pair, I think. Brad, you probably grew up as I did with our longest serving prime minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, as a bit of a joke. He's seen as a waffler. He's not very charismatic. He's not a great leader. He certainly pales in comparison to Churchill and Roosevelt, without a doubt. And yet, you don't survive for 22 years without being a shrewd political operator. And he was. And he surrounded himself with very good ministers, and he had a good political mechanism to support him in the civil service, and eventually a very, very effective military. But King understands that he's got to go down there and get Roosevelt on side. And he'd been doing this before the war, but the war supercharges this. And King makes multiple trips down to Washington. And then, as now, we have to work at that because the Americans have a lot of other things on their mind. They're trying to crash build their military. They're worried about all manner of things, including, of course, the defeat of France and Nazi occupation of Western Europe, the rise of Japan, and the threatening undercurrents of war there. It goes on and on. So it's not easy for Canada, but King works his magic. And even though he doesn't come across as charismatic, and he's sometimes seen as a bit of a joke, and for some who don't know him, of course, he was a spiritualist. He engaged in seances and table rapping. He visited mediums, and he took advice from dead politicians and his mother on the other side, and even his dead dog.
He did.
And yet he did that to confirm his own ideas, right? So he was looking for confirmation, I guess, from himself for his own ideas. And so that tells you something about the complexity of this man. Just as Roosevelt was a complex figure, charismatic, owning the room, finding the right words, and yet with tremendous steel, and he too a long time political survivor. So the two of them come together, and that relationship, Brad, I really found interesting. I don't know if, as you read the book, you had a different appreciation of King.
I did. I mean, I read, this is getting into the niche nerdy stuff, but that's sometimes what happens here, is C.P. Stacy's biography of King, which I think is completely unfair. But with that said, because he focuses on the kooky stuff and him, especially with his diary, which I've talked about at length, and his focusing on clocks and visions, as he calls them, in his dreams and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I do have a more sympathetic eye to him. But the question I wanted to ask you is because in a previous academic life, I started in American history, looking at Pearl Harbor. So for Roosevelt, one of the frustrations of looking at that time period is Roosevelt didn't write a lot. So my thinking is, because you were looking at this really intensely enough for the book, is I can't necessarily get the thought into my mind that sometimes Roosevelt come off as disingenuous. I was wondering if you got a sense of that, if that's got any sort of truth to it with his relationship with King, right? He didn't even call him by his correct name. So I mean, he called him Mackenzie, which nobody did. So I mean, I was always wondering about that. Did they actually literally get along well? Did King just think they did? I mean, I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that.
There were times when Roosevelt found King tiresome. I think in April of 41, if I remember, King goes down there, and there's various disasters and Britain's being bombed, and he's pushing his relationship with Roosevelt. Sorry, it's April 1940. It's before the fall. Yeah. And Roosevelt finds him tiresome on that trip. And he's kind of like the house guest who stays a day too long.
Yeah.
but I do think they seem to have got along, which was a bit strange. Now, without a doubt, Roosevelt is opportunistic. He understands that that King wants to be his friend, and he's happy to have him as his friend. Now, Roosevelt is also very happy to have a stronger Canadian country on his northern border. He doesn't want a weak Canada. This is part of the North American or Northern Hemisphere frontier defense that they need, which includes Newfoundland, of course, then a separate dominion. And there's a neat chapter in the book where both Canada and the United States are friendly invaders onto the rock, and the Newfoundland people welcome them, and there's great prosperity, but all kinds of punch-ups happen over too much alcohol and women and all kinds of things. But the rock is really crucial in the Atlantic. But both Roosevelt and King needed each other, and that's an interesting theme, in fact, that runs through the book. This is a time, while there's no they're not equal. Canada's 11.5 million people. The United States is 131 million. It's already far surpassed Britain in terms of economic output, although not military, but at least before the war effort begins. And yet, you can't defend North America without Canada. And we may talk about this later in the election and all that. But it's still true to this day. Canada and the United States need to figure out how to work together. And we've been really successful at that. And the hinge point, I argue, which I think is irrefutable, is the Second World War. That's where we learned to come together to figure out how we're going to defend the East Coast and the West Coast, the North as well. This is an area of your scholarship, Brad, but when Japan comes into the war and the threat to the West Coast, of course, in a quirk of history, Canada declares war before the United States on Japan, which is neat, but there's a reason for it, right? We have 2 battalions or Sea Force, 2,000 men fighting for their lives in Hong Kong. So there's a reason why we're in this war with the United States, defending the West Coast. And maybe I'm getting ahead of the story here, but we rushed some of our best defenses there. We send 4 squadrons to Alaska. We're involved in the Kiska campaign. The Royal Canadian Navy is running convoys. There's more, but we pull much needed defenses from the East Coast to the West Coast. And we do that not because the threat is equal. It's not. We do it because we need to stand by the Americans. And I think that's an important lesson that I've heard from many people who have already read the book and who've talked about how, it's a story of 39 to 45 and a chapter on the legacy. But boy, it seems to resonate with some of the current security issues in the contemporary dangerous world in which we live.
Yeah, and I want to get towards that towards the end, because I actually have a good question. I think we touched on some of them, but if another one comes to mind, that'd be great. Is from David here. Is what were some of the obstacles to good relationship between Canada and the U.S., and how did things get worked out?
Yeah, thanks, David. It's a great question. I mean, there are a number of obstacles, and I hope we haven't painted this as too easy a relationship. It's always been a challenge. A key one is that Canada is a British dominion within the British Commonwealth. And really everyone called it the British Empire, even though it was technically the Commonwealth. So our hearts are with Britain, even though increasingly our head is with the United States. And I talk a bit about that and everything that falls out of that. The second thing is, it's not easy creating defense and economic and trade pacts in the middle of a crisis. Ideally, you want to do those things when people are thinking calmly and they've got time to reflect on things, but it's a blind panic. And Canada is wary about giving away too much to the United States. And so there's continual debates. There's a great quote from one of our diplomats in 42, I think, and they're talking about the Alaska Highway. And the fear in Ottawa that this seems to be cutting Canada in half, and is this the first step to being annexed or at least becoming just a colony of the United States? And the diplomat says something like, we fought so hard against the British for our own independence, but we seem to be easily falling into the charms of the United States. I'm paraphrasing here, but he's worried that we're too eager to lean into the United States with the goal of supporting Britain. So those are some of just continual obstacles there, I think. However, more often than not, we find solutions that seem to work for both countries, solutions that allow us to engage, once we've secured North America, to engage in sending those expeditionary forces abroad. And I would say, time and time again, Canada reduces its own security to assist in the alliance. We are always taking the hit in the bow of the Atlantic as our warships constantly run back and forth with no chance to refit or to upgrade new technology or even tactics. The torch landings, I think, are fascinating. In late 1942, Canada sends 17 corvettes to assist in the torch landings. And I'd read that years ago. It never quite made much sense. But of course, it's right in the most desperate period of the bow of the Atlantic where, frankly, we're losing it. And we do that and we take the hit there. I've talked a bit about the defense of the West Coast, sending anti-aircraft guns to Alaska to help defend there. There's more here. But I think time and time again, Canada sometimes sits back and accepts that we are the junior partner to the junior partner, right? We're the junior partner to Britain, which is the junior partner of the United States. We might have pushed harder, but that was not Mackenzie King's way. And probably we wouldn't have had much more success anyways. And I think King is, as I've said, Roosevelt was opportunistic. King was also hanging around looking for opportunities. And if there's maybe a lesson in the book, it's that Canada, I think, punches far above its weight during the war, but it also pays for it. It pays for it in treasure, and it pays for it in soldiers, and it pays for it in blood. And that, too, is a lesson for today, perhaps, because I argue we are a consequential nation during the course of the war and afterwards. And it's largely because of we're tied so closely to the United States, but also because we embrace the hard work that has to be done.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to put it. I tend to see how things, and this is leading to my next question, is how the relationship with Britain changes over time. I tend to take it back to the First World War as well, which you obviously know extremely well. You know, it's not just 1917. No. It's going more than that. So I tend to try to keep that in mind when thinking about this. And obviously, Britain has a role to play in that. We had an excellent question about that we can kind of frame a little bit differently because it was coming up to do with the agreements. But I think that can pose a bigger question is Britain's role in this, right? It could be seen in two ways, right? It could be seen as Britain maybe helping keep some of the American at bay, but it could also be seen in a more paternalistic way, right?
Yeah.
Like, going to help little Canada. You know what I mean? Like, I just think that's a really interesting way of thinking about that, because I never got a sense that Canada is dominated in any of the agreements during the war. But that could be, that's just me.
Certainly not the North American ones, I think. And, you know, there were times where we get not bullied, but maybe taken for granted that we're simply going to stand with the Americans on this, or even the British are continually taking Canada for granted. I love Churchill, but he really doesn't want, well, he doesn't like Mackenzie King for one thing, but he really doesn't want Canada to be independent in any ways, because we're an important force multiplier for the British war effort. And I think, you know, we have a pretty good sense of that in the historiography. Our 1st Canadian Army fights, you know, with the British, even though at one point in 1945, we have something like 450,000 soldiers in 1st Canadian Army, far more internationals, including Americans, than Canadians. So, you know, that's an interesting contribution from Canada. And there is an exploration in the book of some of our contributions on the fighting side. You know, Brad, we've talked about the political and the diplomatic and the trade, but those things are essential to secure North America And then we send those expeditionary forces abroad, the Navy fighting in multiple oceans, our merchant marine, the RCAF fighting on multiple fronts, and of course the Army engaged in battle, including 1st Special Service Force, which is a really interesting unit, the Devil's Brigade. Maybe some of the viewers here may remember the 1968 film. Brad, I had fun talking to a veteran years ago. He's since passed away, who was in the unit, and he said, Tim, we remembered it differently than the film. Because in the film, the Canadians are all spit and polished, more British than the British, and the Americans are lovely criminal types who get the job done, Dirty Dozen style, right?
Yep.
And it wasn't that way. It was Canadian officers with American rank and file, and the opposite. And in fact, it was a very effective unit. Its great challenge was reinforcements from Canada. And yet, so I talk about the battlefronts as well. And Canada's contributions are not insignificant on the battlefront. If we just think of 3 amphibious invasions, think of July 1943, Sicily, right? 3 American divisions, 3 British, 1 Canadian, which through a weird quirk, the British are stopped. The Americans are going around the long way. Canada goes up the gut and plays a really key role. Invasion of mainland Italy, Americans on the left, British Canadians on the right. And then, of course, D-Day, 2 British divisions, 2 American with a 3rd in reserve, and Canada, 3rd Canadian Division on Juno Beach. I'm probably not telling people things here that they don't know, or maybe they're being reminded of some of this, although it's important to be reminded maybe of our greatest contribution, which is the Scheldt campaign and the opening up of Antwerp, a time when Canada plays a really consequential role in continuing or battling the logistical famine of late 1944, right? And I argue our most important contribution. But all of that should give even someone who knows nothing about the Canadian war effort maybe some pause in wanting to find more, because even though you and I have talked a lot about Canada here, I hope none of your watchers here think Canada won the war on its own. It didn't. All right, no, I'm not saying that. Brad's not saying that.
No,
but we become a more important nation, I think, than we are often given credit for.
Yeah,
and certainly emerging out of the war, we are, strong military power at the end of the war. We are a wealthy nation, largely because we're tied to the United States, and the world is in ruins. So we need to acknowledge the context.
Yes.
We become, it will take another generation to fully sever, I think, those ties to Britain. Yes. But really, we become more North American. We're more internationalist. We join NATO, and we have
helped to create NATO, actually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But maybe the thing to focus on is coming out of the war is that Canada and the United States have to continue to think about how are they going to work together in hemispheric defense, and the Arctic becomes a key area there. Yep. And NORAD from 1957 onwards as well. And so these are just some of those legacies that are emerging from this really critical time period in world history, but also in Canadian history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really hits the nail on the head with using a very quick summary of all of those major events, which are obviously massive. But I think, and I'm fascinated by this, and again, it's not a surprise to anybody really watching because of the Pacific connection, but I think Kiska is a very interesting case study because of all kinds of reasons. But I think a good way to frame this is as Kevin is asking here, is who approached who for this one? Because I think that could reveal quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question, Kevin. And the Americans approach us on Kiska, and it's part of the defense of the West Coast. And we've already contributed significant forces to Alaska in that period of really fraught danger and uncertainty after Pearl Harbor and in early 42, where we're grossly ill prepared. We look for enemies in our midst. Brad, you wrote a great article years ago about the fifth colonists all around. And so that really helps to explain the along with racism, of course, but it helps to explain locking up of 120,000 Japanese Americans and the forced relocation of 23,000 Japanese Canadians and Japanese nationals. So all of that's happening in 42. And there's some weird incidents where Japanese submarines try to shell a lighthouse, which is kind of a farce.
And they
but
missed.
the Kiska campaign is not. And so we're approached. It seems like a good idea to the commander on the West Coast. Ottawa gets its nose bent out of joint a bit because they really want Washington to ask in an exercise in butt covering, really, in case things go really wrong, because the Atua campaign in May of 43 is a bloodbath. And we send a number of a brigade, and most of them are conscripts. And so that's an interesting element as well. This is an opportunity, it is thought, to allow these conscripts to fight.
Right.
And the campaign itself is a bit of a joke. As some will know, that the Japanese had pulled their forces out, and yet the Canadians and Americans land on this island looking for battle. It's terrible conditions. There are some friendly fire incidents, but that's the one we always talk about, blue on blue episodes. But the key element, I think, at least in this story, is that Canada is there with the U.S. and we're fighting, and our guys are kitted out in American gear. They're using their own weapons for the most part. And so it's an interesting story there. Mackenzie King, who could be as petty as any politician I've ever seen, kind of says, why are we here? This is a useless campaign. And then turns around, of course, and talks about how Canada stands with the United States, and we are clearing the Japanese from the Western Hemisphere and all that kind of stuff. So not the most important of operations, without a doubt, but it has an interesting political element to it. And of course, it's one of the many small movements that we have during the war to really becoming closer, I think, with the American military, which will continue after the war.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it stands out. Those are the two things that stand out for me, really, is because you mentioned, they're kitted out American stuff. The pictures are always, I think, they're funny because luckily, there was not a mass slaughter. Luckily, is that they're in the battle dress with U.S. helmets but still carrying a brand. I always think that's fantastic to see that, because it confuses so many people. But also something too that is fascinating to me, and is kind of an area of academic stuff I haven't done in a long time, but it is conscription, because I think, particularly looking at the United States and even Britain, they have it here. It's much more fraught. It's much more of a problem, because you talk about that in the book, right? The number, there's two major ones: conscription crises, right, with the plebiscite, and then just the crises after the Scheld. So I think that's also something that some other people outside Canada might not know a ton about, is how much of an issue that actually is here.
Yeah, it's not as divisive as in the First World War, where deep chasms open up between English and French Canada, but also farmers and those in the cities and labor and others. It really is a devastating event. The Second World War is more limited, but it does cause internal strife, often pitting English against French, with the plebiscite you mentioned, which was to release the government in April of 1942 from conscription. And yet we didn't really need conscription in April of 42. We are raising very large fighting forces. And one, I've written about that conscription crisis before, the two of them. But, what I thought was interesting was, we don't often talk about the 1.3 million Canadians involved in direct wartime industry, and the 2 million others in indirect industry. And if you add in 1.1 million Canadians in uniform, you get something about 4.5 million adult males and females, women. And it's only a country of 11.5 million.
I know.
So that's almost every single person who can possibly contribute to the war is contributing to the war. And it permeates schools and young people, and there's rationing and recycling. And I have an interesting chapter in the book on the culture cultural output, the National Film Board producing hundreds of films, and the CBC coming into its own. And again, that's an interesting story. It's a bit of a sword and a shield, a shield to protect us from American wartime culture, and a sword to carve it out with our British and American allies.
Yeah.
And I guess, I know we're getting short on time here, but when you think about the totality of the war effort, I've tried to do that in the book. I mean, we've talked about a lot of those aspects. And, I have to tell you, Brad, when I started this about 2 years ago, I took a really big gulp and I looked at the bookshelves that I would have to read, let alone the archival research. And I'm grateful. There are a lot of great scholars who have explored aspects of this. And so, of course, I was not starting from scratch.
Yes.
But it is a big book that draws upon both existing scholarship and some new archival material, and I think new interpretations, new ways to think about the war. And I like to think I've read enough books, and perhaps I've written enough books to see a contribution here. As well, I'm a public historian. To understand my writing, you need to know that I've worked at the Canadian War Museum for 20 plus years, that I write for a broader audience.
Yep.
I've been lucky with my books, I think, that they have an academic rigor, won enough history awards, but I've also won literary writing awards. And so I try to bring them together because I believe it's important to share our history. And this is a book now, especially yesterday with the election and a new relationship, perhaps based on the old relationship, but probably on a new one between Canada and the United States. And again, I hope the book is a contribution in some way to remembering that, Canada and the United States were good allies during the war. And when I started the book, Brad, it was a bit of, as I started at the top, of saying, okay, I want to tell the Americans how much we did.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But
I think you told me that years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. But it goes both ways. And the title, The Good Allies, I realized as I was researching, and no plan survives contact with research, which is great.
Yeah.
I realized that the good allyship went both ways. It, from the United States to Canada as well. And I hadn't acknowledged that as much. And I don't think many historians have in Canada. So I think this is a book that's, I hope will be read by Canadians and Americans, and not just academics. It's one already, I think, that has a chance to reach out and to be a useful guide to the past, but also maybe a way to think about the future.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, like I said, I finished this last night, so lots of thoughts swirling in my head about what lessons can be drawn from here, and kind of even a mindset that can be taken from what's happening was a huge one to me. And we just had a question. We don't need to go into it, but I think it's an interesting way of framing it, at least in how I understood what you were saying in the book. And I think you just kind of talked about that very briefly. I don't have to go into the nitty gritty here, but using the idea of the Battle of the Atlantic, of how it goes both ways, because that is a good example, I think, and particularly how you lay it out, because it's complicated. It seems simple, but it's quite complicated on how that campaign goes, and it's got a lot of, I see them as pendulum swings in a way, especially with the Royal Canadian Navy right there. They're having a tough time, like you already mentioned.
They're having a tough time, but it's a great question from David there. But the Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, I think it'd be fair to say, doesn't always get a fair shake from Canadian historians, and certainly doesn't from British as well. And the RCN is often seen as the poor cousin to the Royal Navy. Some of our scholars, I think of Mark Milner in particular, have done great work to help draw that story out, to Roger Sardi as well. But there are reasons for that. But when you look at the Canadian-American naval interoperability or cooperation, the most interesting period, I think, is in early 1942, when Germany has declared war on the United States, and the American Navy is grossly ill-prepared on the eastern seaboard. Their merchant vessels are running without convoys and without, with lights on, and there's no blackouts in cities, and it's an awful slaughter. I mean, more than 200 about 200 merchant ships are sunk. And it's, the Royal Canadian Navy sees this happening and begins to send warships down south and things like the Triangle Run or sailing to the Caribbean. That's, again, a forgotten part of the story. And again, to come back to my argument, we peel off those warships from the bow of the Atlantic, the convoys there. So again, we're always thinning out our forces to assist others. And I think that's one way to look at that story. There are other command and control elements that are interesting.
Definitely. I mean, it's one. I didn't want to. We're running out of time. I got just one quick questions here, but the one to me is the Canadian as a theater commander. It's the only one.
Yeah, that's right. Very.
So
yeah,
fascinating. And I mean, I just saw quickly a real article. I didn't get a chance to read the whole thing, but just it was talking about the United States Navy as protecting the convoys. Well, I'm reading your book. The numbers are not quite as much as you would think based on where that article was written.
By the end of the war, the Royal Navy supports 50% of the convoys across the Atlantic, the Royal Canadian Navy 48%, and the U.S. Navy 2%.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, as we know, the main effort for the U.S. Navy is in the Pacific. But that does give you a sense of both how Britain and the United States are relying on Canada to get those crucial supplies across the Atlantic, those supplies that are made in North America, and as we've already talked about, Brad, that are critical to keeping Britain in the war and then allowing for the invasion of Northwest Europe. So it's all connected, and I always find when you're writing history, it's interesting to figure out that international war effort to then situate Canada within it, and then to figure out sort of the lower level, the unit level or the community level, and then the individual stories. And I've always believed, if anyone has read my books, I rely a lot on soldiers, sailors, airmen, their letters and diaries. I like to hear from the eyewitnesses. I like them to present their stories. But you can't just string together hundreds of anecdotes. That doesn't make any sense. That's not history. That's something else. Yeah. So you need to continually find the way to scale up from the personal to the unit, to the Canadian, to the international, and back down again. Yep. And I think when it's good history, it feels seamless. And when it's bad history, it's clunky and you're always trying to figure out where you are in a particular time period or why these units are doing something or this really poignant quote from this individual. What is it doing here and how does it matter? That's the craft, I suppose, of writing history.
Well, I can say I've read a lot and I can say you're one of the best at it in current field. So I can say that with complete confidence. And I told you this question was going to come from Norma, who's one of our great voices of spreading the Canadian stories, particularly World War II. What's next?
Oh, hi, Norma. Thank you. Normally I'm working on 2 or 3 books at a time. But the archival chest is low, so I've got to get back in. I've begun to do some preliminary work. I'm editing a book at the Canadian War Museum with some colleagues on the veterans' experience in Canada, and we have pretty solid literature here on the First World War and the Second World War veterans, and a little bit on the Korean War, but we know almost nothing about the post-Second World War time period. So this is a book on the veterans' experience based on hundreds of interviews we've done at the Canadian War Museum for a project called In Their Own Voices, which launched and is on our website if you're interested in checking that out. And really what I wanted to know, well, it came out of my 2020 book, The Fight for History, which looked at what Canadian Second World War veterans were doing and why we did such a poor job in this country in talking about that war effort until quite recently. And I wondered, we need to know more about the veterans' experience. We know a lot of what happened in times of war, but not when they come home, not when they return to their civilian lives or when they retire. And so that's what that project is. And I have another book project. It's an edited collection as well with some scholars at York University in Toronto about Canadian foreign fighters or Canadian transnational fighters. And we had about 40,000 Canadians who served in the American Civil War, 1,600 Canadians in the Spanish Civil War, about 300 Canadians in the Israel War in 1948, about 20,000 Canadians, we think, in Vietnam. And then Canadians are fighting against ISIS, with ISIS, in the Ukraine and others. So we really don't have many studies, as you know, Brad, about this experience. Some call it transnational fighters or foreign fighters. Basically, those wars that are not official by the Canadian state, where we remain neutral, but where Canadians fight. And it's been a really interesting exploration for me. And so those are the two newest projects, and there's a few others. And I'm not quite sure what the next big book will be, Norma, but thanks for the question. Maybe, Brad, you'll have me on in a year and I'll have a better sense of that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. You're welcome back anytime you want. But yeah, that sounds fascinating to me. And we've discussed this on the channel a couple of times, especially Vietnam. We've talked about the Civil War a little bit here as well. And it's so many stories out there to cover and to take lessons from, which I think is a big takeaway. I don't want to speak for you, but for what we're trying to take tonight is some lessons that can be taken away for our current situations and how we can think about things and pretend perhaps in a better way. So thanks a lot, Tim. I appreciate you for coming on.
Thanks, Brad. Appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who joined us.
Yeah. So thanks again. There's links down below to get the book. There's some questions I saw. I'm not going to bring them up because I want you to read the book because the answers are in there. Always leave them wanting more. So thanks again, Tim. And thanks everyone for watching. We'll have another live stream coming up this Saturday, the 9th, looking at the Battle of Hue, actually, in the Vietnam War, some urban combat. So that'll be a really interesting one. So thanks everyone for coming out and hanging out tonight. And I'll see you in the next time. Have a good night, everybody.